Hello, everyone. Today, I want to talk about something. One of the biggest illusions we fall for when dealing with avoidant partners is this idea that their emotional distance is a sign of strength, that somehow their ability to withhold, to remain cool and unbothered, to stay disconnected means that they have the upper hand. We convince ourselves that their emotional unavailability must mean they're in control. They're not as needy, they're more emotionally evolved. And then what do? We start chasing that power. We start trying to measure up, trying to become someone who can finally get through to them. We start thinking, if I can just be patient enough, calm enough, understanding enough, maybe they'll finally let me in. Asterisk. But here's what most people never realize until it's too late. Emotional distance isn't power. It's fear. It's fear in disguise. Fear of vulnerability, fear of intimacy, fear of truly being seen. That cool detachment, it's not some stoic, emotionally disciplined trait. It's a protective layer, and it's built from old wounds, unprocessed pain, and often a deep discomfort with closeness. Once you understand that, everything changes. You stop seeing them as someone who has something you don't. You stop feeling like you're the one who has to work harder to earn their affection. You stop treating their detachment as a kind of badge of emotional superiority. You start seeing the truth. They are afraid. They are guarding themselves. And you've been bending, shrinking, and twisting yourself, trying to break through that armor. When you finally understand this, truly understand it, not just intellectually but emotionally, something clicks inside you. You stop internalizing their behavior as a reflection of your worth. You stop taking it personally when they pull away, go silent, or avoid deeper conversations. Because now, you see what's really happening. You see that their avoidance has nothing to do with you not being enough, and everything to do with them not being equipped to meet you emotionally. This understanding brings with it a quiet kind of power. It's not loud. It's not reactive. It's not about revenge or making them pay. It's about clarity. You stop fighting for scraps of affection from someone who has one foot out the door. You stop pouring your energy into someone who treats closeness like a threat. And the most amazing thing is, when you stop playing that role, the entire dynamic starts to shift. Avoidants are used to people working to prove themselves. They're used to others leaning in harder the more they pull away. That push-pull pattern is their comfort zone. It's where they get to keep emotional control without having to fully engage. But when you stop playing your part in that pattern, when you stop trying to fix or save or prove, they're left with something they're not used to, the mirror of their own behavior. And here's the thing, avoidants don't crumble because you shouted at them. They don't crumble because you begged. They don't crumble because you wrote them a long text explaining all your feelings. They crumble the moment you see through the illusion. Because when you no longer see their avoidance as a mystery to solve, when you no longer give it power or pedestal it, you remove the emotional leverage they had over you. You start walking in alignment with your own self-worth. You stop asking, why won't they let me in? Asterisk, and start asking, why am I trying so hard to stay where I'm not fully welcomed? You stop focusing on what they're withholding and start focusing on what you've been neglecting in yourself, your needs, your boundaries, your peace. And here's what's fascinating, when you truly embody that shift, when you stop giving your energy to someone who has repeatedly shown you they can't meet you where you are, they notice, maybe not immediately, but they feel it, because now, they're not dealing with the version of you who needs something from them. They're dealing with the version of you who has nothing to prove, and that's powerful. It's disorienting for them, because the whole structure they've relied on, the distance, the detachment, the mystery, it stops working. Their fear, which they've dressed up as confidence, gets exposed. And that's when the crumble begins. Not because you broke them, but because they can no longer hide from what they've been running from all along. Emotional accountability. So no, emotional distance isn't power. Avoidance isn't a sign of control. And the moment you stop idolizing it, stop chasing it, and start choosing yourself, everything changes. Not just in how they respond, but in how free you finally feel. Because you realize you were never the one who was too much. You were just offering depth to someone who feared drowning. The more you chase, the more they pull away. You've seen it, maybe you've lived it. That pattern where the more effort you put in, the more distant they become. You text more, they respond less. You try harder, they shut down further. You open your heart, and they close theirs. And you start to feel like maybe if you just say the right thing, do the right thing, love them enough, they'll finally come around. But here's the truth. When someone operates from an avoidant attachment style, your pursuit doesn't bring them closer. It makes them run faster. It's like trying to hug a shadow. The closer you get, the more it slips away. See, avoidants often equate closeness with a threat to their independence. And when they feel that closeness growing, even if it's healthy, even if it's loving, they experience it as pressure. Not because you are too much, but because they were never taught how to hold space for connection without feeling like they're losing themselves. So what happens? You pick up the slack. You start initiating more. You start proving you're safe. You become the emotional caretaker of the relationship, hoping that if you just hold the container long enough, they'll eventually fill it. And for a while maybe they do. Just enough. They give you little glimpses of connection, some warmth here, some affection there. Enough to keep your hope alive, but not enough to feel secure. And that's when the emotional yo-yo begins. Every time you step forward, they step back. Every time you reach out, they lean out. And here's the trap. Your anxiety keeps you invested, because now you've made their validation the thing that will finally soothe you. You think, if I can just get them to choose me fully, I'll feel okay. So you double down, you ignore your needs, you justify the coldness, and you start shrinking your voice just to keep the peace. But the more you do that, the less they respect you. Why? Because what we chase tends to lose its value in the eyes of the person being chased. Not because you aren't valuable, you are, but because people respect what they have to earn. And avoidants, by their very nature, are not wired to respond to emotional overfunctioning with deeper commitment. They respond with withdrawal, not because they're malicious, but because closeness feels unfamiliar, and the easier you make it for them to stay distant, the less motivation they have to confront their discomfort. Now here's the turning point. When you stop chasing, not out of spite, not to play a game, but because you finally understand something powerful, that no amount of effort can make the wrong person ready, that your self-worth doesn't increase the more you prove your loyalty to someone who fears intimacy, that love isn't about convincing someone to stay, it's about choosing someone who wants to meet you halfway. When you stop over-investing, something shifts. You start listening more to their actions and less to their potential. You stop trying to decode their mixed signals and instead start tuning in to how you feel. And you realize that it's not your job to make someone feel safe enough to choose you. It's your job to choose yourself when they can't. And this is where avoidants begin to crumble. Because they're used to being the ones in control, they're used to being chased, they're used to the dynamic where they pull away and you come running. But the moment you stop running, and I mean truly stop, their illusion of power dissolves, and they're left standing in a space they've never had to occupy before, the space where they have to decide if they're going to show up or walk away. Some will walk away, and as painful as that is, it's actually a gift, because clarity is always a gift. But others, they start to feel the weight of your absence, not your silence, not your coldness, just your calm detachment. They feel the difference between someone playing hard to get and someone who's actually hard to forget because now they're no longer reacting to your anxiety. They're sitting in their own. And the most ironic part, the very thing they were afraid of, real intimacy, is now something they find themselves wanting. Because now it's not being demanded, it's being modeled. It's being shown through your boundaries, your grace, your refusal to settle for crumbs. But you're not waiting for that. You're not making moves hoping for a reaction. You're just living in alignment with your value. And that, more than anything, is what creates real attraction. The more you chase, the more they pull away. But the moment you stop, when you genuinely stop, because you know what you deserve, that's when the dynamic changes forever. Because you're not chasing anymore, you're choosing. Here's the truth. Avoidants only thrive in relationships where boundaries are loose, unclear, or constantly negotiated. They're most comfortable when they know the other person is walking on eggshells, afraid to upset them, afraid to speak up, afraid to draw a line. And for a long time, you might have been that person. You may have bent over backward to make them feel safe, tiptoed around your needs, and tolerated emotional distance, because you thought if you just gave them time, they'd eventually come closer. But something shifts when you finally understand that love isn't about waiting for someone to choose you. It's about recognizing who already chooses you. And if they can't, it's about choosing yourself. That's when the power dynamic flips. That's when they start to feel what they were trying to avoid all along, the consequences of their emotional unavailability. When you set boundaries, not out of anger, but out of clarity and self-respect, it does something that rattles the foundation. Avoidants are used to standing on. They're used to the dynamic where you adapt, where you explain, where you overfunction. But now you're no longer asking for scraps. You're not trying to decode mixed signals or make excuses for their inconsistency. You're no longer willing to play the role of emotional caretaker in a one-sided relationship. That silence they hear from you, that space you create when you step back, it's deafening because it's no longer reactive, it's resolved. And here's what most people miss. A boundary is not a punishment. It's not saying you're bad and I'm good. It's saying this is what I need in order to feel respected and safe. And if that's too much for you, that's okay. But I'm no longer shrinking to keep the peace. That is power. That's when avoidants start to lose control over the dynamic, because they're no longer being fed by your emotional availability in the absence of theirs. You see, the reason avoidants often crumble when they come up against a boundary is because it exposes the fragile system they've been operating on. Their control depends on your uncertainty. As long as you're unsure, they can keep you in the limbo of almost close, almost committed, almost ready. But when you step out of that cycle and say no more almost, I want real, and I'm willing to walk away if it's not here, that illusion falls apart. And that's not easy to do, especially when you've invested time, energy, and emotion into someone. It takes courage to say, I love you, but I love myself more than the version of me I have to become, to stay with you. That moment, when you choose yourself, is not just powerful, it's transformative. It breaks the spell, because suddenly, you're no longer available for emotional inconsistency. You're not chasing clarity. You are clarity. And the thing is, avoidants often don't know how to respond to that. They've built an emotional world where intimacy equals danger, vulnerability equals weakness, and closeness equals risk. But now they're faced with someone who isn't demanding, isn't pleading, isn't angry. You're just done. Not in a dramatic way. In a quiet, certain way that says, I'm not going to betray myself for this. And that stillness, that calm boundary, is more jarring to them than any argument ever could be, because it shows them you've stopped looking to them for your self-worth. You've stopped tying your happiness to their potential. And that's when the cracks start to form in their armor, because the emotional control they once had, it's gone. You've taken it back. That's why they often come back after you walk away. Not necessarily because they've changed, but because the role you used to play in their life, being the one who cared more, reached more, tried more, it's now vacant, and they feel the absence. But the most important part is, you don't wait for that moment. You don't live for the comeback. You live in your truth. You stay grounded in what you know you deserve. You uphold your boundary, not to get a reaction, but because it's who you are now. When you operate from that place, when your boundaries are no longer negotiable, you change the game. You stop trying to get love from someone who's allergic to intimacy, and instead, you create space for the kind of love that doesn't need to be chased. You're no longer afraid of losing them, because you realize what you were really afraid of was losing yourself. And once you choose yourself, you stop participating in dynamics that require you to abandon your needs in the first place. That's the moment avoidants start to feel the pressure they've been deflecting, not because you forced it, but because you removed yourself as the buffer between them and their own growth. And if they crumble, it's not your job to save them. Your job was never to rescue someone from their emotional patterns. Your job is to honor yours. Because boundaries don't push people away. They reveal who's willing to come closer in a healthy way, and who was only there as long as you had no limits. The real shift happens when you stop emotionally chasing someone. When you truly detach, not as a game, not as reverse psychology, but because something inside you genuinely lets go. That's when everything changes. That's when you stop trying to figure out what every text means, stop hanging on every crumb of attention, and stop molding yourself into someone who is constantly trying to be enough for someone who never made you feel like you already were. That's detachment, and it's not cold. It's not bitterness, it's clarity. Avoidants don't expect that they're used to the dance. They lean away and you lean in. They go cold and you warm up. They pull back and you chase. It's the rhythm they thrive on, not because they're cruel or malicious, but because emotionally they've learned to protect themselves by keeping people at arm's length. And in that dynamic, as long as you're the one holding on, they feel safe. Safe to be distant. Safe to be inconsistent. Safe to stay exactly where they are. Detached. But when you detach, everything breaks. Their illusion of control. The false safety they felt by staying emotionally unavailable. Because suddenly, you're not where you always were. You're not reaching out, not checking in, not asking, "Are we okay?" You're just living, breathing, healing. You've stopped orbiting around their indecision, and they feel it like a void. At first, they might not react. They may even convince themselves it's what they wanted, that your emotional distance proves you were never that invested. But over time, something shifts. Not because you're doing anything to provoke it, but because you've removed the emotional fuel that kept their behavior going. That quiet shift in your energy, your calm, your peace, says something louder than any emotional conversation you've ever had. It says that they're not willing to suffer, just to be close to you anymore. And that's terrifying to someone who thought you'd always be there. See, the hardest thing to understand about avoidance is that they often don't crumble in the dramatic moments. They don't fall apart when you cry or plead or explain how they've hurt you. In those moments, they pull away even more because it confirms their deepest fear that closeness equals pressure. But when you step back, not in anger, but in acceptance, they feel something they're not used to feeling. Your absence, not physically, but emotionally. You're no longer on the hook. You're no longer waiting for their change. You're no longer emotionally available to their inconsistency. That emotional detachment, that's the one thing they never prepared for. And here's the powerful part. It's not fake. You didn't act detached. You became detached because the emotional labor exhausted you, because the back and forth, the hope that maybe this time would be different, the constant negotiation of your own needs. It wore you down, and in that quiet exhaustion, you finally found your peace. You stopped arguing, stopped proving, stopped pleading for bare minimum effort, not out of spite, but because you started valuing your emotional well-being more than the potential of someone who didn't know how to meet you halfway. When that happens, everything they thought they could rely on vanishes. You're no longer the emotional anchor they could push and pull at will. You're no longer the guarantee. And for someone who's been emotionally distant as a way to stay in control, that loss of control is what begins to unravel them. Because here's the truth: avoidants don't crumble when you need them. They crumble when they realize you don't. When you've stopped playing the role they're comfortable with. When they feel your peace and know it didn't come from them, it came from you walking away. When they reach out and you're no longer eager to respond. When your voice no longer carries that hope, that urgency, that desire to be chosen. That's what makes them question everything. Not because you're punishing them, but because they're finally faced with the impact of their own emotional limitations. And no, this doesn't mean they suddenly become emotionally available or ready to commit. But it does mean the game is over. The dynamic that once kept you powerless no longer exists. You've stepped out of the pattern. And without that pattern, they're left with nothing to avoid but themselves. That's the moment they truly see you. Not the version of you that was trying to win them over, but the version of you that remembered you never needed to. You stopped looking back. You stopped waiting for closure because you realize you already gave it to yourself. And they're left standing in the space where your energy used to be, wondering how they ever let someone like you slip away. And that is when they crumble. When you stop proving your worth and start acting like someone who knows it, everything begins to shift. You see, people who have avoidant tendencies often operate from a place of control, not in an overt manipulative way, but in a quiet, subtle form of control, where they give just enough, say just enough, show just enough interest to keep you around, but never really commit to emotional vulnerability. They don't chase, they don't beg, they don't overextend. And what happens is, we often start trying to compensate for their lack of effort by increasing ours. We overanalyze every message, try to read between the lines, convince ourselves they're just complicated, that they need time, that if we're just more understanding, more patient, more loving, we'll finally unlock the version of them we know is buried somewhere deep inside. But that's where we fall into the trap. Because the moment you start proving your worth to someone, you've already forgotten it. Here's what you need to understand. Avoidants are attracted to the dynamic where they don't feel emotionally threatened. They feel safest when they know you're the one emotionally investing more. That way, they get the validation, the attention, the emotional intimacy they secretly crave, without having to reciprocate fully. They maintain a sense of control by staying one step removed. And if you keep trying to win them over, they'll never feel the need to meet you where you are. But something fascinating happens the moment you stop trying to be enough for someone who won't commit. When you shift your focus away from convincing someone to choose you, and instead embody the energy of someone who knows they are already enough, it completely disarms them. Why? Because you're no longer playing the game. When you're no longer checking your phone constantly, no longer rearranging your schedule for last-minute texts, no longer sitting with anxiety over why they didn't follow through or say how they felt. When your energy becomes grounded in your own self-worth, they start to lose the very control they were depending on. It's not about playing hard to get. That's still rooted in trying to gain someone's attention. It's about actually not needing their validation anymore. That's the difference. That's where the power is. Confidence, real confidence, isn't loud, It's quiet, steady, and unapologetic. It doesn't chase. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't try to prove it deserves love. It just is. And avoidance, they don't know what to do with that. Because they're used to emotional imbalance. They're used to people proving, persuading, pulling. But when you stand your ground and calmly say, "This doesn't work for me," without resentment, without pleading, just from a place of truth, they don't have a script for that. It throws off their entire pattern. And it's not because they're villains. It's not because they're heartless or incapable of love. Often it's because somewhere along the way, they were taught that intimacy is dangerous, that needing someone means weakness, that closeness invites disappointment. So, they create distance as a form of self-protection. But here's the thing, you are not their therapist. You are not the one who has to prove that love can be safe. That's their journey. And the most powerful thing you can do is step back and let them walk it, without sacrificing yourself in the process. You don't teach someone to respect you by tolerating their inconsistency. You teach them by showing that your time, your heart, your energy are not available to someone who only shows up when it's convenient. And when you do that, when you walk away, not in anger, not in games, but in grounded self-respect, you shift everything. Suddenly, they're not in control anymore. Suddenly, you've become the one they can't quite figure out. The one who didn't stay in the cycle. The one who didn't need them to heal. Avoidants crumble, not because you punished them or made them chase you, but because you removed the very fuel that kept their pattern going. Your emotional labor. You became untouchable in the most beautiful way, not because you're cold, but because you finally saw your own value and stopped offering discounts to someone who never intended to pay full price. And that's the moment everything changes. Because confidence disarms control. Every single time, you become irresistible when you're no longer available. It sounds counterintuitive, right? Because everything inside you, especially when you're emotionally attached to someone, is screaming at you to stay connected, to be there, to show them your value. But the truth is, the more you try to prove yourself to someone who is emotionally unavailable, the less they feel compelled to show up. And the cruel twist, the second you stop doing that, the second you start living your life as if they're not the center of it, everything changes. See, people with avoidant attachment styles often function on one predictable cycle. They get close just enough to spark your interest, then pull back the moment it starts to feel real. And for a while, that keeps you on a leash. They know that when they go quiet, you'll get anxious. When they withdraw, you'll reach out. When they give you just enough affection, you'll mistake it for connection. And as long as you keep showing up, even when they don't, they never have to question their behavior. But then something shifts. You hit your emotional limit, not out of anger, not out of manipulation, but because you're exhausted. Exhausted from the confusion. Exhausted from feeling like you're always asking for scraps. Exhausted from waiting for someone to decide you're enough. And when that exhaustion turns into clarity, that's when your energy starts to shift. You stop being available, not in a cold, calculated way, but in a natural, I have a life to live, and I'm not waiting anymore, kind of way. And here's the irony. That's when the avoidant crumbles. Why? Because the control they had, that emotional safety blanket of knowing you'll always be there, disappears. Suddenly, they're the one wondering where you went. Suddenly, they're questioning your feelings. They start testing the waters, sending you subtle signals, trying to pull you back in. But this time, it doesn't work. Because you're no longer hooked by inconsistency. You're not emotionally starving anymore. And their crumbs don't fill you like they used to. That's the moment they feel something they're not used to. The consequences of their own behavior. See, they never expected you to wake up. They relied on your hope. They thrived on your overgiving. But once you stop showing up for the role they cast you in, they're forced to sit with the reality they avoided. That connection isn't something they can control. It's something they have to nurture. And they don't know how to do that unless they grow. But that's not your responsibility anymore. You see, when you're no longer available, emotionally, mentally, even physically, it changes your energy, and people feel that shift. You start walking differently, talking differently. You're not chasing, you're choosing. You stop asking, do they like me? And start asking, do I even like this version of love? That self-respect is magnetic, not because you're trying to be mysterious or play a game, but because you're genuinely no longer willing to betray yourself to be chosen. And that is incredibly powerful, especially to someone who built their sense of safety around emotional distance. Because now they're the one feeling uncertain. They're the one wondering if it's too late. And here's the beautiful part. You're not doing any of this to get a reaction. You're doing it because you finally understand your worth doesn't live in someone else's comfort zone. Your peace isn't negotiable anymore. Your attention is earned, not assumed. That shift, from anxious to anchored, from proving to protecting your energy, is where the real transformation happens. You're not chasing validation anymore. You're not performing emotional labor in hopes that someone will finally meet you halfway. You've stopped begging for consistency from someone who couldn't even offer clarity. And because of that, you're no longer available to situations that drain you. You're not trying to win them back. You've already won because you got yourself back. And maybe they come back. Maybe they reach out. Maybe they say all the right things. But this time, you're not swayed by words. You're watching actions. You're not leaning into potential. You're measuring reality. You're not hoping they'll change. You're noticing whether they already have. You've evolved. And now they have to decide whether they're ready to meet you at that level. Not because you're giving ultimatums, but because you've outgrown the version of you that tolerated emotional half measures. You no longer make space for people who only show up when they're afraid of losing you. And that is the moment you become truly irresistible. Not because you're playing hard to get, but because you've finally understood you're not something to be gotten. You're something to be honored. And when you embody that truth, everything that isn't aligned with it starts to fall away. Chesed. That's when the avoidant crumbles. Asterisk.